Hello again. Didn't expect to see me so soon, huh? Well, frankly, neither did I. Today's topic, unconventional bottle throwing tactics, namely the best way to weaponize empty beer bottles for pelting at your young son's head. But even more specifically, being the last human girl alive in a world without women. What would that be like for a child to go through? How would a child process such a dangerous, terrifying, and violent existence? Such a niche hypothetical scenario is entertained by a little game called Lisa the Joyful, a short DLC epilogue where you play as Buddy Armstrong following the conclusion of Lisa the Painful. If you haven't seen my video essay on Painful, I recommend doing so for greater context and comparison, because while I view Lisa the Painful as a miraculous combination of rewarding mechanical arrangement and genuinely life-altering narrative that produces a cult classic of brilliant construction, Lisa the Joyful is lesser. Significantly lesser. A hand's breadth from tangibly disappointing that is anchored to emotional salience by its attachment to Painful and a few aspects of its design and story. I originally planned to make this video a few months away from Painful, to space out my unhealthy and borderline obsessive fixation with this masterpiece, but my therapist and multiple mental health professionals have urged me to get this out of my system quick before I shave my head bald, develop a drug addiction, and get into fistfights with random pedestrians. So please, unsheathe your blood-slicked blade and contemplate the great trials ahead that you must face to ensure your own safety in a world full of monsters, because I'm about to explain why Lisa the Joyful was a joyless experience worth playing. Gentlemen, hit 'em with the 666 Kill Chop Deluxe at your earliest convenience. Turn-based combat can be difficult to do well. In a gameplay style that is all about patience, deliberate thought, and taking your time, how can you invoke a sense of chaos and carnage that makes the experience exhilarating? How does one supplement this with depth that makes combat a rewarding challenge, especially if it's the primary method of navigating your problems? Dear viewer, after copious amounts of staying indoors at my computer, I have the answer. Turn-based combat is fun because there are a lot of moving pieces at your disposal that provide a number of different ways to confront problems in your way. Painful works in a similar way. Throughout your journey, you gain access to new party members that have different skill sets, making them applicable for different fights. Some are useful for fights against large groups of enemies for how they can hit them all at once. Others are good against specific bosses to avoid particularly devastating attacks. And some you keep around for the eye candy. But if you fail, death can come ever so swiftly. Scary! Because he just did that! Come on! Come on! Painful's combat is simple, yet your method of engaging with it is so modular and customizable that it's a fantastic source of fun. Considering it's how you get through most of the game, it's important that this works. Because of how fast the animations are and how high tempo the bizarre music is, it also conveys a sense of that carnage and chaos that keeps things active and inviting. All of this is wrapped up in tangible challenge that makes victory ever sweeter. So imagine my encroaching despair when I boot up Joyful and slowly come to realize that the combat sucks. It just sucks. For almost all of the game, you have one person in your party. At the beginning you have Rando with you to help as Buddy levels up, but after a certain point, he just disappears and it's only you until the very end of the game. No party members to collect, no additions to the team, nothing. You are on your own. And of course this makes sense, it's a small epilogue to Painful, the closing dance to the main act, and you just wouldn't have room to cram in such a large roster. But this reduction of characters is a damning blow to Joyful in ways more complex than just less people on the screen. Because for most of the game you only have one person in your group, this is the baseline of which everything in the game has to change, and I mean everything. Groups of enemies in Painful were genuine threats, especially the thieving bastards of the Rhodes Scholars who not only tried to steal my mags, but stole a whole hour of my life. But they could be, because you had a whole party. you had a group of 4 to fight them with, meaning more room to disperse damage, and, as a result, you can make fights harder because you had more tools to counter with. If you didn't have 4 party members because some of them died, then the fight would be even harder, which would be fair because it was through your own failings that you've been left in such a disadvantaged position. In order to get better at the game and master the harder fights towards the ending, you had to fight to keep up with enemy parties during the beginning. In Joyful, because you only have one person, fights can't be hard. With only one character, you have to be given enough time and room to recover from hard attacks, so battles aren't unfair beatdowns. It also means that there are fewer groups of enemies in a game, and instead, the majority of fights are duels. This then means that a lot of the fights are just games of punches, endlessly attacking back and forth until one of you calls quits. The depth and complexity that invested you in the fighting originally is gone, afforded through the wide cast of characters you had at your disposal, which makes the primary gameplay loop mind-numbingly dull. The way Joyful attempts to remedy this is by making buddies' TP moves like Decisive Stab quick time events. You have to hit a button as the ring closes on the border of the circle to land a critical hit, whilst missing just does the damage of a regular stab. This makes fighting more active, as it requires the player to be paying attention as to when she strikes. And while this is a nice change of pace, it's a band-aid fix that only exacerbates the problem. The QTE for stabbing is extremely annoying when you first play. There's zero warning when Buddy is going to strike, no wind-up or preamble. So during the parts where you have Rando, you have to guess when she's going to attack, which completely throws off your timing. There's also zero explanation as to what you're aiming for during the QTE, because there's an outer and inner ring, which, even with my superior intellect, makes it indiscernible as to where you need to hit. This addition to your attacks also rewires how some of the status debuffs work. Pissed in Painful used to be a serious effect to get hit with, because it wrenched control away from one of your party members and made them completely unreliable. They were capable of dealing insane amounts of damage to either the enemy or you. They were running wild during times where you really needed to have all your playing pieces available. You also had others like Crying or Blind that significantly reduced the chance to hit of your attacks. The tools you had at your disposal were also shared by the enemy, and this needed to inform how you would approach encounters. But because Buddy has a primary move that isn't dependent on a hit chance but instead the player's own input on a QTE, this means that a bunch of these debilitating status debuffs just don't matter. If an enemy pissed me off, they just gave me a free boost to my crit chance. If they blinded me or made me cry, it didn't affect anything. By trying to introduce this more active way of playing to compensate for less going on, it gouges even more of the fun challenge that Painful introduced to the design of Elisa games. And because combat is like this now, it also means that fights are awfully stretched out. If there were long fights in Painful, you at least had the animations and rapid nature of the brawl to keep you engaged. But because a lot of Joyful's fights are just slapping competitions, it drags out everything. The tension deflates, the fun wanes, and the music starts to become a bit torturous as it endlessly repeats over and over and over, and your ears start ringing, and your heart starts beating louder, and you start to question everything. Where's Terry? Where are my items? Where's my bike? Where's Brad? Where's my Tiger Man husband? Why does Buzzo look so fucking ugly? But that's enough of that. The combat of Joyful isn't great. It's oversimplified down to malnourished core components that fail to spark much joy in the player. But it's called Lisa the Joyful, right? Joyful. So what happened to those cute little blue pills? Those fun-sized narcotics for friends and family that were pivotal in gameplay and story of Painful? Well, dear viewer, they're still here. And they're as blue as ever. The only thing that's changed is the introduction of a new ingredient that soured the taste and forever diluted the formula of this crucial device for game and story. Ludonarrative dissonance. For those unfamiliar with this fun term, ludonarrative dissonance is a video game phenomenon where the video game's narrative told through non-interactive elements conflicts with the narrative told through how the game plays and ultimately the player's actual experience of said game. And the existence of ludonarrative dissonance is exclusive to video games because it's the only one where you have to consider the separate experience of the audience. Saying that something is one thing or another isn't enough to cement that as fact. It needs to be presented in a manner where the player can reach a similar conclusion by themselves. Lisa the Painful is a lot of great things, but one of the most remarkable parts about it is that, during my time playing, there was never a moment of ludonarrative dissonance. Everything that the story dictated was made apparent through the gameplay. Joy mutants were to be feared because they could take your party members away permanently at any moment. Rhodes Scholars destroying Factory Town was bad because it would deprive you further of potential trading locations. Joy truly was addicting because it would relieve the player of the stress withdrawal brought, but debilitating because the more you took it, the more you'd need it to keep Brad in check. Buzzo's choices were tough because it put Brad's fighting ability against the lives of party members you had come to value both sentimentally and mechanically. And ultimately, the story of Brad Armstrong's bizarre adventure mattered because the player came to realize the peril Buddy was in and the emotional turmoil Brad was in. I was always in line with how Brad was feeling, I understood Brad's motivations, and I loathed the hellscape of Olave in the same way he did. Brad is such a beloved character because not only is he likable despite his flaws, he's someone the player is able to relate to. His irrational origins for wanting to save Buddy doesn't alienate the player from sympathizing with him, considering the fate Buddy is destined to fall victim to otherwise. But unfortunately for Lisa the Joyful, as a result of the many changes made to the game to support a shorter installment centered around only one party member, Ludonarrative Dissonance makes quite the celebrity cameo. Joy mutants aren't able to instantly kill you anymore, so instead their fatal attacks just do slightly more damage. They're immediately disarmed of their significance. There's that Joy mutant at the end called Sweetheart that is just so deadly and lethal that Buzzo has to turn up to intervene and save you, but it's so unnecessary because before he arrives, you're kicking its ass. So instead of it being this point of character development where he stands against certain death as an act of sacrifice for a remnant of Brad's legacy, he just gets his dick twisted for zero reason and, as a result, is implied to be physically weaker than a 12-year-old who has picked up a sword for the first time in her life. Joy isn't needed at all. The combat enhancement they provide isn't addicting because there's no withdrawal to incentivize use, nor any foes that make you even remotely consider it. I'm frankly quite fucking insulted that the Terry's Terroids are even a thing in Joyful. Oh yeah, we better add this into the game lest a lobotomized snail has a tough time. The most egregious of these instances, however, is the boss fights. Your mission is to eradicate all opponents to your reign, and that involves dealing with the many surviving warlords of Olave. Boss fights in Painful were hard encounters that necessitated liberal use of healing items and equipment to survive them. Deciding when and where to use your magazines to keep your larder stocked was a similarly tough affair. Painful's combat was hard because you didn't have a designated healing character. You had to rely on finite items and spend mags at inns to fully recover your HP and SP. But because of the simplicity of Joyful's fighting, combined with the fact you just don't have a shopkeep at one point, the boss fights are ridiculous. Maybe I'm saying too many words. Let me make this simple. Here's my reaction after beating a boss in Painful. Nice, he hit himself. Yes! Get out of here, Therafinity! Oh yes, I knew we could do it without losing anyone. Oh yes! And now we have Tiger Man on the team. And here's my reaction after beating a boss in Joyful. I didn't even need to do anything at the end, that man just bled out. Oh, that was him? You're kidding me! The disparity between these two is hilarious. You have no items to use up during boss fights, but don't fret, that's because you have a special move that immediately recovers half your health. Ignore this is a lie, because every time you get hit hard enough for it to matter, you get enough TP to immediately use it again. You end up in these unending loops of healing and taking damage, waiting for a lapse in the attack to strike back, and this experience is so foreign to Painful's boss fights that it should be considered fucking extraterrestrial. When the #1 warlord in all of Olave, a hulking wolfman that the game repeatedly tells you you're just not ready to fight yet, is an easier fight than a band of random nonces you find in a desert, how can you possibly take this game seriously? I'm not terrified of this guy, I just want to ask him out to dinner. This is made even more hilarious considering Joyful has almost none of the quirky, bizarre humour Painful has, yet is infinitely less sincere across the board. The most threatening thing in Lisa the Joyful is a fucking ledge. Oh well, fuck me. But I think the final damning blow is that at the game's climax, Buzzo reveals that Buddy is becoming a Joy mutant and needs to take a miraculous vaccine Buzzo just has, for some reason, to stop it. I was aghast, genuinely aghast, that for the narrative peak of this epilogue, they were relying upon the use of something you didn't need. Why, you may ask? Because I had never taken Joy. Not once. And despite this very voluntary act of player freedom, one that Painful accounts for and overrides in a fair manner, Joyful mustered no effort to do the same, and instead just retcons the player's own actions into having used joy. This egregious design oversight, plagued by ludonarrative dissonance as a result of one simple change to how the game plays, can't hold a candle to the narrative failings of Lisa the Joyful. Lisa the Painful sought to explore a lot in its story. Addiction, paranoia, and repressed emotion all stemming from Lisa's self-inflicted demise in Lisa the First. A result of Marty Armstrong's alternative style of parenting that makes Daddy 5-0 look tame by comparison. How in the midst of humanity's death, a time devoid of any meaningful purpose, Brad finds redemption in a baby girl that he has to protect from a world that will use her for their own nefarious and sadistic desires. Extremely compelling, involving, and ultimately heartbreaking. But the world of Olave is quite the mystery. As our delightful bald-headed video essayist Nern Guan orates, life after the Flash is bizarre, and has messed with the very day and night cycle of the world. So many unanswered questions, so many aspects left unexplored, and so much mystery as to how the world collapsed into the state it is now. Lisa the Joyful, while presenting the perspective of the last human girl in the world, sought to uncover the shadowy secrets of how the world of Lisa came to be. And, right out of the gate, we have our fatal flaw. What Lisa aimed to establish across both Joyful and Painful, more so in the former than the latter, was that Dr. Yado saw Olave as the perfect place to try out his experimental drug Joy for the sake of military application. Buzzo was charged with the duty of distributing Joy throughout the land to see how it would affect a male-only sample. Buddy is Dr. Yado's daughter. There are a lot more semantics to this, but let's cut right to the chase and instead sum up my feelings towards this with the testimony of this polite gentleman. The key issue I think Joyful makes in part of its writing is wrongfully assuming the value of this hypothetical apocalyptic scenario. A world without women is novel, but I didn't enjoy exploring it so much in a literal sense during Painful. The setting gave rise to introspection of Brad's character and struggles that worked well to set stakes in a more literal narrative foreground while making significant developments to the more emotional and abstract metaphorical background. How Brad's instincts are set into overdrive because people want to do horrible things to Buddy, almost a replica of a situation he experienced at home. And it's because of the knowledge of how this scenario ends that he's so desperate to forsake the world in favor of Buddy's safety, even if it brings out mixed results. All this shit about genetic manipulation and military application and narcotics distribution and whether or not Yado is Buddy's father, I just could not possibly care about any of it. I didn't buy into Painful because of a Metal Gear Solid B-plot, I bought into it because it took a great focus on characters, on ordinary people during extraordinary times. Buzzo was brilliant in Painful because it was this unexplained phantom of guilt in Brad's path that he just couldn't avoid. The mystery added so much to his role both literally and metaphorically, but the events of the story make it that he's just some ugly looking doctor's pet that is less powerful than a 12-year-old girl. Because Joyful sets out to do this, it halves the already little time it has to round out the profound experience of Painful in the way the audience had already bought into, not to mention that a lot of it isn't answered in a satisfying manner anyway. What worked about Painful was because it didn't seek to explain every single aspect of everything, the audience understood it wasn't the focal point, and didn't seek to interrogate anything. We didn't need to know the specifics of what the Flash was, or what happened to all the women to be involved. But because Joyful starts to open the door on some of these things, it also opens the floodgates for everything else. Where are the other women? What happened to the women in Olave? Why was Buddy used as an experiment, and what end did she serve to assessing Joy's potency? Why even bother doing this to assess a drug when you could just do it in a lab instead? And what the fuck even was the Flash? That's never explained at any point. It works better as this mysterious happening used to set the stage for the emotional turmoil of Painful, as opposed to this supposedly intricate conspiracy that just doesn't stand to much scrutiny. The only way Joyful seeks to evaluate the more emotional and mental aspects of the story is through the budding protagonist, Buddy Armstrong.
Hello!
Imagine being raised in a world where everyone wants to hurt you, kill you, or do things to you that don't involve consent. The only way to brave the outside is to walk around wearing a mask. Buddy saw Brad's care as captivity, wanted to turn herself to helping save humanity, even if it meant potential abuse, and through Brad's repeated attempts to intervene, his protection became synonymous with everything she despised. Within minutes of the game starting, Buddy distrusts everyone and everything, even her own compatriot, Rando. While Brad's idea of safety was to hide from the world, Buddy's is to cleanse it of all those who could potentially come after her. And this is where, again, a flaw is made. It's evidently intentional that Buddy isn't meant to be particularly likable. She's childish, immature, and brash, and quite mean to those around her. It makes sense, because if you can't trust anyone or anything, even those that claim to help you, why would you hold them in any positive regard? These are the results of everything she went through in Painful. But just because it makes sense doesn't mean it clicks well for an audience, nor does it necessarily mean that it's going to align with how games tell stories in comparison to other media forms. Buddy may not like or trust Rando, but the player does. Buddy may not like or trust Brad, but the player does. Buddy may want to kill everyone to secure her place in the world, but the player likely doesn't. From the get-go, the player's motivations are clashing head-on with so many of Buddy's that it makes it hard to relate to what she's going through, which puts a lot of the significant moments of the story in jeopardy. There's this especially hackneyed moment where you go to one of the warlord's villages and the game keeps prompting you to kill the innocent pacifist villagers, really hamming it up at their defenseless people, and the most it emotionally summoned from me was an exhausted eye roll. This is textbook ludonarrative dissonance, a game trying to make you feel bad you'd even consider murdering these hapless civilians, when at no point did the player even make it apparent that's what they wanted to do. If this had been the focal point for Joyful instead of explaining the circumstances of the environment, maybe this could have worked. It feels like in places there is the structure of some profound moments you'd have expected to see in Painful, but when it's so torn between these two aspects, it just can't seek to make either particularly interesting. All the while, the pacing of the story is just so weird. There's some random jump cut to Buzzo having a dream at the very beginning, and then we just don't ever see him again until the very end. We get through the shit list of laughably easy bosses and one failed grinder date before suddenly Dr. Yado's here, who, by the way, is meant to be the final boss for the entire game. A guy who you hardly see at all during Painful that is now immediately meant to have the necessary narrative importance and personality to carry the story's climax at a moment's notice. I hate ripping on Joyful so much because Painful was such a work of art, but if it wasn't for its connection to Brad Armstrong's bizarre adventure, I would have quit after one stream. And I think that's quite fitting, really. It's only through Joyful's place in the Lisa franchise that it holds any emotional salience, just like how it's only through Buddy's connection to Brad that she has a chance to be redeemed. It's rushed and it's anticlimactic, and the existence of a vaccine for joy, something that worked well as a metaphor for how indulging in something to flee your traumatic past only serves to turn you into a monster, is something I would have expected in a fan game. But there is an ending to this. One that, I think, made me reach an understanding as to how I felt about Lisa the Joyful. After enduring the confusing mess of Joyful, you get to the end and are presented with two choices. Take the vaccine, abandon the hallucinations of Rando and Brad, or let the joy mutation take form and become another artifact of despair. Both are quite haunting ends, and while there's not much to say about either, I think there is a message lodged in this tower of mutant, wrinkled flesh. The cycle of abuse devoured Brad. No matter how hard he tried to do good for the world, there was always something over his shoulder that stopped him from seeing it all to fruition. Until Buddy. Brad gave it up, all for her. Friends, allies, drugs, and parts of his own fucking body, all gone for the sake of others. It was through his persistence, punctuated in the bloody carnage the Olathian wastelands are known for, that he managed to finally give Buddy a choice. She wasn't doomed to be a broodmare for humanity anymore. There are no guarantees to anything. Olave is still a mess, inhabited by murderer and violent dissident aplenty, and there's no certainty that everything is going to end well. It's an uncertain future. but it's not a doomed one. Buddy has a chance to not just save humanity, but now to spare herself from that insidious cycle and live a life that is truly her own, not dominated by drunkard patriarchs, not dictated by cruel bandits, and not infringed upon by the dastardly experiments of Dr. Yado. Joyful wasn't a fun game. A lot of what made its predecessor so amazing was compromised by small gameplay changes and a misunderstanding as to what made its story so meaningful. But, as an inverse, playing it also made me just appreciate what I loved about Painful and, by extension, my love of the trilogy for just existing. It gave me an ending that finally gave me closure for all the emotions that bastard Dingaling cruelly made me feel. The gaming industry has come so far, technologically innovating entire worlds and cities from lines of code all to the beat of professionally orchestrated music and iterated in pixel-perfect visuals. Yet the thing that so viscerally affected me was a trilogy made on an engine from 2012 designed to make dinky little RPG Maker games. Lisa has, for the first time ever, inspired me to take a look at making a video game of my own that maybe one day I'll get to share with the world like Dingaling shared with us. And to be able to encourage and spur on others to take up the art, to see video games as a place where both casual entertainment and soulful storytelling can cross paths. I think that's the dream, right there. So I bid farewell to Lisa, a trilogy that has captivated me for the last few months of my life, and hope the fond memories of my complete and utter investment in the tortured world of Olave will inform my own creative endeavours, become the cornerstones of my future works, and hopefully one day I'll get to enjoy someone else's video essay about why they loved it so much. All of this, every good and bad, is why Lisa the Joyful was a joyless experience worth playing. But for now, dear viewer, I think I need a break. I'll see you later.
Speaks to